Hey there, how's it going? Andrew here with another painting video, and it is so good to be back with you once again after so many months off. I've got a jam-packed video for you today. Roll that intro. Now in today's video, we're going to be painting landscapes from direct observation or en plein air. And it's amazing what you can learn by studying your subjects from life. I've spent so long cooped up in the studio working from reference material that sometimes you end up getting stuck in your ways. And one of the things that I've found is a lot of my heroes, like Sargent, Sorolla, or Arthur Streeton, they painted outside, and when I look at their work, I really appreciate that loose brushwork, that vibrant color, and that masterful communication with paint. My issue is that when I'm working in the studio, I tend to get tighter and tighter and tighter. And so I wanted to think of a way that I could loosen up and take what I had learned from outside and bring that into the studio. So the idea for today's video is very, very simple. Could I use en plein air painting techniques to loosen up my studio painting? So I've set myself some parameters here with this little exercise. First of all, rather than work en plein air on little tiny 8x10 panels, I was going to go bigger, about 16 by 20 or 20 by 24. Now, that extra size would then cause me to have to make marks that were bold and big and expressive just to cover that amount of ground. Now I'm also going to be working with a limited palette of LANGRIDGE handmade oil colors, and I'm going to keep the size of my brushes pretty big. But the one thing that is really going to cause me to loosen up with these paintings is I'm only giving myself an hour and a half to cover that ground. So let's get outside. Let's have a go painting en plein air, and let's see what we can learn from this process. I am so lucky to live in this part of the world. This is Lawrence, Central Otago, and the rolling green landscape here is just waiting to be painted. I'm becoming quite familiar with this scene as well, as it's often where I walk the dogs. Now before I get things underway, I'm going to take a couple of reference photographs exposing for both the light and the shadow to bring out all of the colors in this landscape. And I'm taking these photographs just in case I want to go back and finish this painting off with some real detail in the studio later. I'm working with a palette of LANGRIDGE handmade oil colors, and I call this a limited palette, but it allows me to mix a wide range. And I'm painting on stretched Belgian linen on a frame that is 16 by 20 inches. Now I'm really shooting from the hip here in terms of composition and making snap judgments as to the major planes in the landscape. Now again, I've only given myself an hour and a half, so I have to make these decisions really quickly. And I'm drawing these lines directly onto the canvas using a small bristle filbert brush, using a combination of burnt umber and quinacridone magenta. I'm also using Winsor & Newton liquid as my medium here, which will allow this painting to dry pretty quickly. And if I want to go back and work over it in the studio, I'll be able to do that the next day. And there you have it. The map for the composition is done. As you can see, there's not a lot here, but everything's in the right place. I'm ready for color. Now there are many schools of thought on where to start your painting. Some people like to start with the lights, while others prefer to paint the darks first. All I'm trying to do is create a sense of depth right from the outset. So I go for whatever's furthest away in the landscape. I knock in a simple overcast sky and then start to bring those distant hills forward, moving with the tiers of depth of the trees from those mid-ground hills all the way to the near foreground. Now I have sped this up as a time lapse, but I'm also moving pretty fast. I've tried to keep the size of the brush nice and big so I cover that ground quickly. I'm fighting every temptation to get out a smaller brush and start painting detail. That's not what this exercise is about though. I keep telling myself it's about loosening up and creating big expressive marks. I've become really anxious because I notice that the light in the landscape is shifting, and I just want to catch what's happening in those distant hills. So with a little bit of cadmium yellow, yellow oxide and titanium white, I just knock in a little bit of a sun highlight there in the distance. But I have to be so quick because I notice those clouds are whipping by and I'm only getting brief moments of light in this scene. But when the sun finally does emerge, it's creating these amazing sculptural effects with those hills. I was painting in the shade and now I'm in full sun, which is giving me some ideas of how to bring that light into the foreground. Working directly over that wet paint that I had established before, I'm using a bit of cadmium yellow and yellow oxide again with some titanium white. Time's up. Time to put those brushes down. It's been an hour and a half. That's all the time I'm going to give myself for this exercise. It certainly is a lot looser than my normal work, and I feel I've got something to add to later in the studio. Now that was a real challenge, and one of the things that I found the most difficult to contend with was that shifting light and just how quickly I lost the light in this scene. But still, in an hour and a half, we covered the whole canvas, and not all is lost. I mean, sure, it's not my best work and it's not a great painting by any means, but I have the base there to be able to take into the studio and just add to it a little bit. I'm pretty happy with it so far, but what I really want to see is, can I take these techniques and paint something a little bit more complicated, perhaps with a man-made element in there as well, like an old shed. So I found this scene in a place called Waitahuna, which is just down the road from Lawrence in central Otago. Now, this is a really interesting scene. And again, I'm going to run into all sorts of challenges with this as well. But let's have a go and see what we can learn from this particular painting. I'm setting up on the side of the road well out of the way of any cars, although on this particular day I didn't see any. So it's pretty cool, having this landscape all to myself. And I bought this particular easel setup from a New Zealand En Plein Air master, John Crump. Shout out to John. This is such a sturdy easel and it carries all of the gear that I need. Now the light at the moment is perfect, but I don't know how long it's going to stay that way, so I take a couple of reference photographs just in case I want to refer back to them later in the studio. Again, exposing for the light and the shade. And again, I'm working on Belgian linen that has been stretched around a 16 by 20 inch frame. And using a small filbert bristle brush, I'm going to sketch in the major lines of the composition, starting with this big oak tree on the right, and then nestled underneath it, I'm going to have this little old shed. My horizon line's going to go somewhere around the lower third, giving plenty of room for those distant hills. Now you'll notice that there's quite a gap between the shed and the tree, but I thought it might make it a little more interesting to put these two elements right up against each other. Working in the same fashion as a previous painting, I'm going to start with my most distant elements and then bring these layers of depth forward. I mute the colors in the background purposefully to try and create a sense of depth. These contrast against more saturated colors in the foreground. I'm using a combination of filberts and flats in a range of sizes from about 1/2 inch to 1 inch across. I also keep many brushes in my hand at once, rather than trying to get one brush to do the job of all these different colors. This keeps my colors nice and clean as I knock in this canvas. I've been really lucky with the light on this particular afternoon, and this painting came together quite quickly. My biggest challenge, though, is dealing with that wind. I find it's really knocking the canvas around. It even blew over my camera setup. Still, those are the challenges we face when painting outside. It's still amazing, though, to just be here and watch that light and to take it all in. I'm certainly gaining a little bit of experience to take back into the studio, which I feel will make me a better painter in the end. Whenever painting an architectural element, I try to focus on straight lines and sharp edges. It's difficult when your brushes are so big, but you can create a little bit of sharpness by bringing these edges together and focusing on that boundary of light and shade. I knock in the foreground quite quickly using whatever green was left on my palette, knowing that I might have to saturate this a little bit later in the studio or maybe here in this sitting to bring the foreground all the way forward. And I'm going to break up this massive green with some of these weeds like dock, as well as sheep here that are going to form a really necessary element in the composition and add to the overall story in the scene. I felt in this sitting that even painting the legs on the sheep would be too much detail. I increase the contrast and add a little bit more saturation in that mid-ground field behind the shed, and bring a little bit of this color into the foreground. With a little bit of adjustment in the tone of those sheep, I'm just about finished and certainly have an adequate base to work with in the studio. Again, I've tried to keep this nice and loose and not get bogged down in any detail, but I do feel this composition will need some more work. Time to take the wet painting back to the studio and give it some more thought. The point to being out here, though, and painting en plein air amongst the elements is to learn what nature does and to take in these transitions in light. Hopefully some of this will rub off on me and I'll be able to put it into my bigger studio paintings. Now there's another building right next to that old shed that has got some really cool textures and angles to it. I was really lucky on this day because I had a couple of horses keeping me company and I thought they would make a really interesting addition to the composition. So let's have a look at this slightly more complicated scene and see what we can learn. In this particular scenario, I do run the risk of having too many elements competing for attention within the scene. And also I have to consider this light and weather that's really rolling in from the south. I don't know how long I'm going to have to work, but hopefully I can get this done in an hour and a half. Time to get out the color. And what's crucial about this palette is that I keep the order consistent. And on my palette here I have burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow oxide, titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, quinacridone magenta, dioxazine violet, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, phthalo blue, and phthalo green. And just as I'm about to start painting, I instruct the horse to take position here in the composition. Just kidding. He's not going to listen to me. Now, with so many things going on within this image at one time, it's difficult to know where to begin. I make a small dash for the horizon. That should allow me to place the hill, and then the barn will sit along this line somewhere. Now, this is the main focus for the composition, so I block this in and have it take pride of place. Some diagonally sweeping lines will allow the viewer's attention to be directed towards the barn, and now I'm ready to start blocking in the sky. One of the things that I enjoyed about the previous two paintings was the speed at which the sky came together and set the mood and lighting for the entire scene. Of course, again, this is the most distant element, so it should come first. Then I can start adding more problematic colors like yellow. This with the blues that I was using in the sky will make green, and green is always a danger because it tends to come pretty far forward. But if I desaturate it enough, it'll allow it to sit here in these distant hills. Now I've got some darker patches on those hills, which are stands of pine trees. As long as I keep these light enough, they won't come too far forward. With a bit more saturated green and a broad stroke with the brush, I establish that distant field around the line of the horizon, and then begin to establish the roof lines in the barn. Now, one huge challenge for me at the moment is dealing with the total lack of light. I'm finding that all of my colors are approaching gray, and it's difficult to differentiate between tones. One of the things that I'm really missing is any sort of direct light, and I'm hoping that I find a break in the clouds soon to give a little bit of contrast to this scene. But still, I can knock in some texture here into the side of the barn and establish some major architectural elements within this piece. My go-to for the grays here on the barn are a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. I have a little bit more ultramarine blue coming through though to give that cold, corrugated iron look. I need to place a couple of horses within this composition somewhere, and I choose this area in the lower right. This might offset the composition somewhat and cause the balance to shift, as I've allowed that shed to get pretty central within the composition. If I add a second horse to it though, suddenly it doesn't feel quite right, perhaps a little bit too heavy, and takes too much attention away from the barn. But this is the thing I love about painting, is that you can always think on your toes and make snap judgments, and change things if they're not quite working out. So perhaps the placement here, behind this horse in the front, would work much better. So with that decision made, I remove that one by just brushing it out. Now this old barn has got some really cool textures to it, and I love what the years of weather have done to it. I like the patchiness to the individual sheets of iron, and some of that rust will add a really nice bit of detail. But again, this exercise is not about detail, so I have to knock this in the best I can, and maybe it will inform a nice big studio painting. But here, I'm just trying to make notes and capture the overall essence of the scene. So once I've got the shed blocked in, I focus on the foreground and knock in my greens. This happens quite quickly, starting with that darker green and then a mid-tone of green. And again, the huge challenge for me is I have totally lost the light. There's no sun in this scene at all, and I thought I might get a lucky break, but it hasn't come about just yet. So while I'm working in the shade, I might as well establish where this horse is going and really solidify the shape. I'm just going to use a bit of burnt umber, mix this with some ultramarine blue, and not worry about any details whatsoever. I decide to get rid of the second horse. Maybe one horse in this painting is going to be enough. Sometimes you can define shapes by painting where they are not. So I use the background to bring the green in towards the horse to just sharpen up the edge a little bit. I'm going to improvise and try and imagine where this sunlight's going to fall by mixing just a little bit of cadmium yellow and yellow oxide. This will give me a bit of a brighter green and hopefully give me the illusion of a bit of sunlight in the foreground, but it's not quite the same. And just like that, the sun appears from nowhere, but only for a second. Thank goodness I was rolling a little bit of video so I could capture that moment and maybe refer to it back in the studio later. But just imagining what that light was doing here in the foreground, I continue to add just a little bit more saturation and increase the level of contrast here. And while I'm busy concentrating, I didn't catch that the light had appeared again and revealed some amazing textures on the side of this barn. So I decided to sharpen up some of these lines with an ivory dagger. Even though I said I wasn't going to do any detail, I just can't help myself. The clouds have parted and revealed an entirely different scene than what I started with. So now I'm really struggling thinking about how I'm going to add this extra warmth and atmosphere to the landscape. It seems like a little bit too much to try and handle in this sitting, but I'll just do the best I can. Again, I've only allowed myself an hour and a half for this painting, and already I can see what the experience of the first two paintings has given me. I've covered a lot more ground and packed in a lot more information into this scene than those previous two. And that's the thing I find with painting. It's like anything really. The more you do it, the better it gets. But how often do we give up on things? It almost sounds like a bit of a cliche, but if we stick with it, it will get better. Having solidified the composition and having covered the entire canvas, I'm ready to add just a little bit more information here to the painting. I notice a willow tree over on the far left that I thought I'd bring in to the edge of the barn, and maybe this will cancel some of those vectors on the left-hand side. It is so awesome to paint outside. I can't tell you how addictive it is to accumulate these experiences and to get new ideas for bigger studio paintings. To get that light as well, which only happens in really brief little moments I'm starting to notice. What started off as a dull gray scene has turned into something full of light, color, and atmosphere and given me a really solid idea to take into the studio later. But again, the main aim of this exercise was to loosen up, to cover ground quickly, and to try to learn to become a little more expressive with my brushwork. I feel I'm slowly getting there and becoming a little bit looser and more confident with my mark making. I'm really starting to appreciate how artists like Streeton, Soroya, and Sargent were able to handle their subjects. They made it look so easy. I wasn't quite satisfied with that first landscape of Lawrence, and I thought one of the challenges that I might be able to overcome was the weather, by picking a better day to do it. Now, I'm going to give myself 2 hours with this next little painting, and I'm going to work on a slightly bigger canvas, 20 by 24. And if I had a little bit clearer light and a bit extra working time, maybe I could turn out a better painting. Let's see how I went with this one. Now already things are looking up and the sun is shining. I've also got a bit more color in this scene as the season is starting to turn some of those leaves a nice golden color. My canvas is much bigger now and there's not a moment to lose. I decide I want just a little more precision and control with my mark making here in this initial stage of sketching out my composition, so I'm using an ivory dagger. It can be a real challenge just working out how to fit everything in. But once I'm happy with the arrangement of shapes, I begin to thicken up some of the lines. Now, I would normally work over a burnt sienna wash, but I just wanted to jump into this painting. I didn't even have time to tone the canvas. As usual, the light is shifting across the landscape pretty quickly as those clouds pass overhead. I begin to work in the vast distance just above the horizon to where the deep shadow of some clouds are. Now already, in comparison to the white of the canvas, this color appears to be very dark indeed, and this is why I always tone the canvas first. But I figure if I just keep going and get the entire sky region covered, these colors will start to register the correct way against one another. These clouds have got a really lovely warm tinge to them, and I'm going to achieve this by mixing just a little bit of burnt sienna, yellow oxide, and quinacridone magenta with my titanium white. You can overdo this combination though and get a little bit too yellow with your colors, so make sure that you desaturate with plenty of titanium white. Now while the sky region is wet, I'm going to blend some of these colors across. And once this is finished, I can then start to bring the landscape forward, again in the usual fashion, working the most distant elements coming forward. These distant hills here, the blue mountains, are a combination of cobalt teal, ultramarine blue, with desaturation given by a little bit of burnt umber. I can allow for a little bit more of a green tinge by just having a hint more cobalt teal come through the mix. My aim is always to mix colors that will allow me to have a sense of depth within a two-dimensional painting. And by mixing on location, I'm really beginning to appreciate what the sunlight is doing to the landscape colors. I'm finding it quite a challenge to deal with such a stark white canvas, but so long as I keep my paint nice and thick, and my brush loaded with paint, then I should be able to cover this canvas in no time without much white showing through. Now again, green is always a challenge when trying to achieve any kind of depth dynamic within a two-dimensional picture. So I approach this problem slowly by going for my most desaturated yellow first, which in this case is a yellow oxide. I mix this with plenty of titanium white and ultramarine blue, and then I can gradually increase that saturation as I bring the scene forward. Now you may notice that the brush I'm using is pretty small, but I've allowed myself an extra half an hour for this painting. And I figured that as long as I keep my brushwork loose and expressive and nice and bold, I'll still be able to get that canvas covered nice and quickly within the 2 hours that I've got. Now you'll notice over on the right hand side that those gold colors in the highlit grass and the tops of those trees are getting a little bit more intense. And this is given by a little bit of that cadmium yellow and cadmium red with a mixture of that yellow oxide. I'm going to mix this in with some greens though and make sure that I blend occasionally between my strokes where necessary. Now I begin to block in that dark stand of pine trees. And though it might look like it's a black, it's far from it. The base of this color, though, is ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And as long as I keep it a little bit lighter with a bit of titanium white and yellow oxide to just give it a green tinge, I should be okay, and these elements won't be too oppressive. It's amazing what this shifting light does to a landscape, and how the change in contrasts illuminates different forms. Also, I'm beginning to lose my light really quickly, and this weather has come out of nowhere. I thought I was going to have a really nice sunny day painting, but it looks like plans have changed. I better be quick and knock in the rest of this scene before it starts raining. Without that direct sunlight, it's difficult to gauge the exact color of these autumn trees on the right-hand side, but I do the best I can, and maybe if the sun does reappear, I'll be ready for those highlight colors. It almost appears to be this desaturated muddy brown color for the base of the trees. If I get a chance to have a little bit more light here, I can add some of that highlight sparkle to the tops of these leaves. But again, that's the challenge with painting en plein air, making these judgments with color and trying to mix exactly what you see. I've been bringing the scene forward from the furthest elements, working my way towards the foreground. And it's time to block in this big pine tree, which is actually a stand of pine trees. It forms quite a dark shape, and I need to make sure that this dark is a little bit darker than those mid-ground trees, but not so black that it forms too much of a distraction. So again, I'm using my ultramarine blue and burnt umber with a touch of yellow oxide. A little bit of titanium white will allow me to lift that color towards the edges of the tree. But now I've lost all my light, so I can't tell exactly where that highlight is going to fall on the tree. But if I had the right reference material, I might be able to go back and get this into the painting later on in the studio. I've got this large white area now that needs attention in the foreground, and this is all going to be the foreground paddock. With plenty of green paint on my palette, I need to increase the saturation with a little bit more cadmium yellow and yellow oxide. I've got no light to work with here at all though, which is really frustrating because I remember this scene being so spectacular when I first got here. But still, I'll methodically work this color downwards into the foreground. And even without the light, I'm kind of happy with the way this landscape's taking shape. Time for some sheep. They're really needed in this scene as a foreground element to lead the viewer's eye in. I'll knock these in with a darker color, and then focus attention on getting rid of that white background canvas color. By having a little bit of variation in my greens between the saturation and tonality, I'm able to create just a little bit of variation and texture here in the foreground paddock. With the end of a brush, I'm just going to go and kill all of those little white spots that are showing up between my brush marks that may form a distraction. Now my sheep are pretty far from white. The first thing I do is establish a kind of mid-tone, which is primarily titanium white with a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. This makes a bit of a cold gray color. I then map out where individual sheep are going to go and make sure that I'm happy with the arrangement of animals throughout the foreground. And once I'm happy, I just add a little bit of a highlight, which again I have to imagine because all of my sun's gone. As is often the case with painting on plein air, it rarely turns out as you first imagine. But again, we've got a great start to take into the studio and add to. Maybe it'll make a bigger painting. I think it's got some potential. Despite the challenges and the setbacks that I've had with the weather, it's been such a joy to work from direct observation. Now that was challenging. Is it my best work? Absolutely not. And it's certainly far from the quality of Sargent, Streeton, or Sorolla. But I did learn an awful lot from this exercise, and I've got a lot of stuff to take back into the studio. Now, working on such a large canvas within that hour and a half to 2 hours did allow me to loosen up my brush strokes a little bit. I had to be light on my feet and make these snap judgments when it came to the shifting light and also just composing on the spot. So I certainly have enough material here to go on and create some bigger studio paintings and take what I learned from outside and bring that into the studio. So maybe if you find that you're in a similar rut to me of working constantly from photographic reference material, maybe give this a try and see if it adds a little something extra to your studio painting. Now, if you like this video, then hit that like button for me. And if you want to come back for more and see more videos just like this one, make sure you subscribe to this channel. And also click that bell icon so you're notified when I upload another video. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, but also make sure you're subscribed through my website at www.andrewtischler.com. Thanks so much for stopping by. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.